For generations, the history of the Shinobi world has treated the downfall of the Uchiha clan as a foregone spiritual conclusion. Scholars, leaders, and even the clan's own descendants blamed it on an ancient mystical boogeyman, the curse of hatred. We were told that malice was simply hard-coded into their lineage, a metaphysical darkness that inevitably corrupts anyone who carries their blood. But the archive doesn't deal in mysticism. We deal in schematics. Up until now, our deep dives have focused strictly on the hardware configurations of the Sharingan, how the ocular peripherals are wired, how they source external power, and how they bridge to foreign hosts. But to truly understand why this bloodline consistently burns itself to ashes, we have to look past the physical chassis of the eye and conduct a forensic, psychological audit of the host's operating system. When you strip away the myth, the poetry, and the wartime propaganda, you are left with a brutal, clinical reality. The curse of hatred is not a supernatural phenomenon. It is a severe, biologically amplified case of post-traumatic stress disorder. The Uchiha aren't born evil. They are human beings trapped inside a body that runs an irreversible, inescapable 4K trauma recording engine. And the moment that engine boots up, it doesn't just change their eyes, it systematically destroys their minds. To understand how this engine works, we first have to understand how a normal human brain survives horror. In a life or death combat scenario, the standard human mind initializes a highly sophisticated set of emergency defense mechanisms. It floods your system with adrenaline, forces intense tunnel vision, and, most importantly, it purposely blurs, fractures, or completely represses the most horrific memories of the event. Your brain actively deletes the worst data packets to preserve your sanity, protecting the host's psyche from collapsing under the weight of the trauma. The moment a 3-tomo Sharingan initializes, it completely overrides those evolutionary safeguards. The eye forces the brain's data gates wide open, granting the user a flawless, microscopic level of perception. And Uchiha in battle doesn't get the luxury of a protective mental blur. Their hardware captures the battlefield with surgical, uncompressed clarity, recording every severed limb, every agonizing scream, and the exact fluid dynamics of a blood spray pattern in perfect, hyper-detailed resolution. And that is just the baseline capture phase. The true devastation lies in the infinite playback loop. Because the Sharingan functions as a near-photographic, permanent visual data drive, and Uchiha mathematically loses the biological capacity to forget or dull the razor-sharp edge of horror. The human brain is designed to let memories decay over time so wounds can heal, but for an Uchiha, time is irrelevant. Every single time they close their eyes to sleep, their neural pathways run an exact, high-fidelity, uncompressed replay of their worst nightmares. The playback loop runs with the exact same crisp, terrifying detail as the literal second it occurred. They are trapped in a museum of their own trauma, forced to watch the exhibits loop forever. Which brings us to the Mangekyo threshold, the absolute breaking point of the host's psychology. The awakening of the Mangekyo isn't just an upgrade in raw power, it is the ultimate systemic shock. Witnessing the death of a loved one is captured by this advanced hardware with absolute, pristine, uncompromised clarity. The sensory data is so massive, and the emotional context is so devastating, that the eye permanently burns an unerasable, corrupt file of pure psychological horror directly into the visual cortex. The hardware reaches its peak efficiency, but the human mind underneath it is completely shattered. To fully expose this biological reality, we have to look at the historical data through a modern lens, starting with the observations of the Leaf Village's second Hokage, Tobirama Senju. Tobirama famously stated that the Uchiha are a clan who feel love more deeply than any other, but when that bond is severed, a unique, volatile chakra is unleashed from their brains, unlocking the power of the eye. Tobirama viewed this as a cold, genetic flaw. But if you map a realistic psychiatric diagnosis onto this biological loop, you quickly realize it is a devastating, self-feeding mechanical feedback loop. The brain secretes a unique, highly specialized chakra during periods of intense emotional trauma to unlock the hardware of the eye. But once that hardware is active, it strips away the brain's natural defense mechanisms. The unlocked eye now forces the brain to process all future trauma with massively increased fidelity and intensity. More trauma creates more severe neurological damage, which triggers more intense ocular evolution, which in turn captures even sharper horrors. It is a closed system built to self-destruct. This brings us to the symptomatic manifestation the Shinobi world calls lashing out. In our world, severe unmanaged PTSD manifests identically. Hypervigilance, emotional detachment, profound paranoia, and sudden explosive rage. These are not signs of innate evil. They are defensive survival mechanisms. When an Uchiha, like Madara or Sasuke, lashes out at the world around them, it isn't because an ancient ghost or a mystical, supernatural curse is pulling their strings. It is the behavior of a profoundly broken, highly traumatized human being pushing a hostile reality away as hard as they can, desperately trying to shield themselves before the world can inflict another uncompressed scar onto their mind. It is a survival response pushed to a catastrophic, world-ending extreme. And within this framework, we find our control group, what we can call the sociopath control. The only Uchiha who could ever remain completely immune to being driven mad by this relentless sensory overload are those who are entirely devoid of empathy or clinical sociopaths from the absolute start. If you don't feel love, you don't experience the trauma of its loss, and the feedback loop never boots up. But for a lineage that naturally experiences emotion with profound depth, the Sharingan isn't a gift of power. It is a biological death sentence for the human psyche. To truly map the scope of this mental health crisis, we must trace it back to Generation Zero, the foundation upon which the entire Uchiha legacy was built. We begin with the wartime patriarchs, Madara and Izuna Uchiha. Their diagnostic category is severe, chronic developmental PTSD and the normalization of violence. Unlike later generations who were born into structured villages, Madara and Izuna's clinical profile is defined by sustained child-soldier combat exposure. Their baseline Sharingans were initialized when they were just children, forced to record the brutal, bloody slaughter of their own siblings week after week, year after year. Because a meat grinder battlefield was their baseline environment, their profound trauma underwent a sinister psychological process. It became completely normalized. Their brains adapted to survive by locking themselves into a permanent state of high alert territorial paranoia. Peace was not a concept their operating systems could even process. The ultimate hardware integration happens when Izuna is killed and Madara merges his brother's eyes with his own to forge the world's first eternal Mangekyo Sharingan. In the lore, this is treated as a monumental ascension of power. But through a clinical lens, the reality is horrific. The new hardware didn't just inherit raw chakra and a grander dojutsu layout. It carried an unerasable, permanent digital archive of Izuna's lifetime of continuous warfare, copy-pasted directly into Madara's already fractured occipital lobe. When you look at Madara's historical actions, his ultimate inability to trust Hashirama, his violent rejection of the Senju alliance, and his paranoid withdrawal from the very village he helped build, it becomes clear that this was not a spiritual flaw or a supernatural curse. It was the rigid, unyielding survival algorithm of a severely traumatized child soldier. Madara Uchiha mathematically could not conceptualize a safe world because his hardware would never allow him to forget the one that broke him. If Madara represents a lifetime of slow, boiling wartime erosion, our second case study represents a sudden, catastrophic system failure. Subject 02, Obito Uchiha. His diagnostic category is defined by a complete psychological fracture, acute shock, and dissociative nihilism. Unlike the founding patriarchs, Obito completely lacked years of gradual battlefield mileage. He had no psychological scar tissue or calluses to buffer an uncompressed 4K trauma feed. He was an aggressively clumsy, deeply empathetic kid tossed straight into a brutal war, going from a minor skirmish directly into getting crushed in a cave-in, only to wake up in the pitch-black underground of the Akatsuki progenitor. Because his own mind was fracturing, his psychological survival mechanism was built entirely on an outsourced illusion. He externalized his sanity, anchoring it to a single core directive. Kakashi will keep Rin safe, because I gave him my eye. Rin was his anchor to a benevolent reality. Then, the blood mist ambush happens. When Obito arrives at the battlefield, it isn't just that he sees Rin die, it is how the sensory data is delivered. The exact millisecond Kakashi's Chidori pierces Rin's chest, Obito's native right eye records it. Simultaneously, his transplanted left eye, still psychically bound to Kakashi, transmits the exact same image from a mirror angle via their shared sensory link. His hardware didn't just record her death, it captured a stereoscopic, hyper-detailed, cross-angled visual feed of his worst nightmare. His entire trust matrix collapsed. The outsourced illusion shattered, and his cognitive operating system experienced a total, catastrophic crash. What follows, the immediate, frenzied, hyper-violent massacre of the Mist Anbu, is a classic, textbook manifestation of an acute psychotic episode driven by pure, trauma-induced rage. It wasn't a tactical combat choice. It was a human mind tearing reality apart because reality had just torn him apart. But a human brain cannot survive living inside that unerasable 4K looping memory of the massacre without completely shattering. To keep his psyche from total biological collapse, Obito's mind chose to completely dissociate. He didn't become a cold, calculating sociopath. He did something far more radical. He chose to believe that the physical world itself was a fake, corrupted, broken simulation. If reality is just an illusion, then Rin never truly died, and the blood on his hands doesn't actually exist. The Toby persona and the orange swirl mask were never just a clever battlefield disguise. They were a literal, structural, psychological firewall meticulously built to protect a broken, weeping child's mind from the horrific reality of his own actions. While our first two subjects represent the long-term erosion of war and the sudden shock of a reality-shattering betrayal, Case Study 03 presents the most tragic psychological failure of all, the absolute systemic collapse of a pacifist mind under the weight of an inescapable, high-definition nightmare. Subject 03, Itachi Uchiha. His diagnostic category is unique, heavy, and devastating. Systemic compassion, fatigue, and catastrophic moral injury. Itachi's clinical profile begins long before his infamous betrayal, rooted in severe early childhood war trauma. He was exposed to the horrific, rotting aftermath of the Third Shinobi World War at just 4 years old. Before his fundamental moral compass was even formed, his young brain was forced to record endless stacks of battlefield corpses in pristine, high-fidelity clarity. Later in life, this sensitivity became his ultimate curse. Functioning as a double agent, trapped between a paranoid, hyper-surveilling Leaf Village leadership and his own radicalized, coup-plotting clan, his eyes were forced to hyper-analyze every ounce of systemic rot, deceit, and malice from both sides. He was drowning in uncompressed metrics of human corruption. Then came the catalyst, witnessing his best friend Shisui commit suicide right in front of him. The agonizing emotional shock of that moment locked his Mangekyo Sharingan into place. In that exact millisecond, the hardware burned a permanent, unerasable file of absolute despair directly into his visual cortex. Itachi's deeply sensitive, naturally pacifistic mind suffered what psychologists classify as a catastrophic moral injury, a profound psychological wound that occurs when a person is forced to witness or participate in actions that violate their deepest moral beliefs. In this shattered, overstimulated state, the impending threat of a bloody civil war became an insurmountable data stream of impending doom. His mind could see no peaceful exit. Driven by an absolute sensory overload of incoming horrors, Itachi's cognitive operating system suffered a radical, purely cold utilitarian break. Through his fractured psychological lens, a brutal mathematical calculation became entirely rational. Executing his entire family with his own hands to protect his younger brother and prevent a world war was deemed an acceptable trade-off. Itachi did not execute the Uchiha massacre because he was heartless, or because an ancient curse made him cruel. He did it because his deeply empathetic mind had been entirely broken by a relentless, high-definition data stream of human malice. He chose to carry the sins of the world, unaware that the hardware in his skull had already stolen his sanity. If our previous subjects represent the biological casualties of war and systemic corruption, our fourth case study represents something far more sinister. A mind systematically, intentionally engineered by trauma. Subject 04, Sasuke Uchiha. His diagnostic category is the absolute zenith of clinical severity, chronic compounded PTSD and cyclical re-traumatization. Sasuke is the ultimate artificial product of weaponized psychological torture. At just 7 years old, his brain was not yet fully developed. Itachi didn't just force him to discover his parents' bodies. He trapped the boy inside the Tsukuyomi, forcing his fragile young psyche to record and catalog the slaughter of his entire clan over 500,000 times in the span of 48 hours. The standard human brain is designed to bury trauma. Tsukuyomi did the exact opposite. It took a pneumatic drill to his mind, permanently hardwiring the neural pathways of absolute terror and helplessness into his skull before his personality had even formed. What follows is a tragic pattern of multi-phase re-traumatization. Every single time Sasuke's system attempted to heal, build a new safe haven with Team 7, or form stable emotional attachments, the universe forcefully stripped it away. At the hands of Orochimaru, and later during his re-encounter with Itachi, his psychological scab tissue was violently ripped open. His entire development was stunted, locked into a permanent, hyper-vigilant fight-or-flight response where power was the only variable that guaranteed safety. But the absolute, systemic core collapse occurs when he learns the post-mortem truth about Itachi. The sudden awakening of his Mangekyo Sharingan is not triggered by the death of an enemy, but by the catastrophic realization that his entire life was a lie, that he had hunted down and murdered the one person who loved him most. His cognitive operating system completely shattered under the weight of this paradox. His sudden shift into hyper-violent, manic behavior at the 5 Kage summit is the absolute apex of traumatic paranoia. When Sasuke stands before the world laughing in the dark, he is experiencing an emotional overload so severe that his psyche has fundamentally detached from reality. To validate the catastrophic, unerasable horror burned into his eyes, his mind arrives at a desperate defensive survival mechanism. If the entire Shinobi system is built on the torture and slaughter of the people he loved, then the only way to guarantee he will never be deceived, hurt, or broken again is to completely burn that system to the ground. Our final subject is the most critical component of the entire psychological audit. He isn't an Uchiha patriarch, a rogue avenger, or a victim of the clan's internal politics. He is a total outsider. Subject 05, Kakashi Hatake. His diagnostic category is the definitive proof of our model: intrusive flashbacks and chronic depressive isolation. Kakashi is the absolute control variable that completely validates our biological thesis. He possesses 0 Uchiha blood, meaning his DNA is completely immune to any ancestral, metaphysical curse or transmigrant spiritual malice. Yet, he displays the exact same severe, crippling, multi-decade psychological decay as the native hosts. The common denominator isn't lineage, it's the hardware. Kakashi's clinical profile is defined by a non-native hardware integration and irreversible memory burning. The exact millisecond Rin Nohara stepped in front of his Chidori, Kakashi's borrowed Sharingan eye did exactly what it was engineered to do. It copy-pasted that image into his brain with absolute, undeniable, unerasable fidelity. Because a non-Uchiha body cannot turn the peripheral off or safely buffer the unique chakra demands of the eye, That high-definition image was permanently burned into his standard neural pathways. Because the hardware permanently anchored that visual data packet, Kakashi became mathematically incapable of letting the memory naturally decay. This mechanical trapping of a nightmare manifests as severe real-world intrusive flashbacks and deep somatic compulsions. For years, Kakashi would obsessively scrub his right hand under running water, driven by a phantom somatic trigger, his traumatized brain convincing his physical body that Rin's blood was still physically wet on his skin. He didn't have the Uchiha biology to process or weaponize the trauma into rage, so his system internalized it. He managed his broken neural pathways through chronic emotional isolation, hiding his face behind a mask to distance himself from a hostile world, and spending hours standing entirely inert in front of the Leaf Village memorial stone. He wasn't just paying respects. He was trapped in an inescapable playback loop of his childhood nightmares, driven by a camera he could never choose to unsee. Kakashi Hatake didn't inherit the curse of hatred, he simply held the camera, and it broke him just the same. If we don't understand the mechanics of the curse, we can't understand how Sarada breaks it. Up to this point, our forensic audit has mapped a bleak, unbroken continuum of psychological decay. From Madara to Sasuke, we watch the native Uchiha hardware systematically grind the host's psyche into paranoia, nihilism, and violence. It seems like an inescapable design flaw. But a machine is only as predictable as the engine it is running on, and if you change the underlying neurochemical operating system, you completely rewrite the system output. This is the biological foundation of Section 5, the Daylight Patch. To understand why the curse of hatred suddenly breaks down in the modern era, we have to look at how sex-based, biological, and endocrine profiles fundamentally alter how a human brain processes acute stress and trauma. The Uchiha hardware doesn't exist in a vacuum. It relies entirely on the host's native hormones to trigger its neurochemical chakra. For generations, our entire dataset has been skewed by a dominant male blueprint. Strongly modulated by high baselines of testosterone and adrenaline, the male trauma response pushes an overstimulated amygdala into a permanent, hyper-aggressive fight-or-flight state. In a native male Uchiha, this manifests as the traditional cycle: a rigid reliance on competition, weaponized outward rage, and deep paranoid isolation. But human biology possesses an entirely separate trauma vector, the female blueprint. Mainstream psychiatric research demonstrates that the female stress response is heavily modulated by estrogen and an overwhelming surge of oxytocin. When subjected to severe acute trauma, instead of defaulting to a pure fight response, the female endocrine profile activates what modern psychology titles the tend and befriend mechanism. Under extreme stress, this operating system prioritizes social bonding, the immediate defense of loved ones, and collective preservation over destructive, isolated retaliation. When we map this alternative physiological framework directly onto Sarada Uchiha, the myth of the daylight breakthrough is instantly demystified. Sarada breaks the ancestral mold because her system processes emotional energy through an entirely different neurochemical filter. Look at her baseline awakening. Her initial Sharingan code wasn't written by recording a bloody battlefield slaughter or watching a comrade die. It was initialized by the agonizing emotional distress of abandonment and an intense, attachment-driven longing to connect with her absent father. Her baseline trigger was born from a desire for attachment, not a reaction to violence. The ultimate stress test of this model occurs at the Mangekyo threshold. Sarada's Mangekyo didn't awaken out of a blinding desire to inflict vengeance, nor did it spark because she felt isolated from the world. It triggered from an overwhelming surge of pure, agonizing empathy and panic as she witnessed reality rewrite itself to turn the entire world against Boruto. Her system registered a catastrophic threat to her safe haven. But where Sasuke's male blueprint commanded him to isolate and burn the system down, Sarada's female neurochemistry defaulted to its primary evolutionary command: protect the bond at all costs. She dropped to her knees not in a fit of manic rage, but to fiercely plead for the preservation of her companion. Sarada Uchiha isn't called the Daylight Uchiha because of some magical poetic rewrite of her eyes, nor because she is inherently better than her ancestors. She earned that title because her female biology processes the exact same uncompressed 4K trauma stream through a filter of profound compassion, systemic shielding, and survival-driven bonding. She didn't beat the curse of hatred. Her biology simply repurposed the hardware, converting weaponized malice into an absolute shield of preservation. Before we close this data log and archive our findings, we must address the inevitable pushback from those who insist on clinging to the spiritual orthodoxies of the Shinobi world. The deepest defenders of the traditional narrative will always point to the myth of Indra's reincarnation. They will argue that the curse of hatred cannot be clinical, because Madara and Sasuke were the literal transmigrants of Indra Otsutsuki, born with his ancient, vengeful chakra signature bound to their souls. But the archive does not deny the spiritual cycle. We simply look at what is actually being transferred. Indra's direct bloodline doesn't inherit a malicious ghost pulling their strings from the afterlife. What they inherit is a severe, hereditary, genetic vulnerability to neurological stress. In modern psychiatry, we know that certain genetic lineages carry an extraordinarily high predisposition to severe PTSD and emotional hyperreactivity. Indra's transmigrant chakra acts as a structural amplifier, ensuring his descendants inherit the most volatile amygdala responses and the highest emotional sensitivity in human history. They aren't born with evil in their hearts. They are born with a biological gunpowder keg in their skulls, waiting for the spark of trauma. And what about the outliers? The history books love to praise Uchiha Kagami and Uchiha Shisui as individuals who miraculously bypass the curse entirely. But these rare exceptions don't break our clinical model, they prove it. In any population exposed to severe trauma, a microscopic percentage of individuals exhibit an unusually high baseline of natural psychological resilience. Kagami and Shisui possess an exceptional configuration of cognitive empathy and stable emotional attachment styles. Their prefrontal cortexes were structurally robust enough to maintain logical executive control, dampening the signal of a hyperstimulated visual feed. Yet, even Shisui's ultimate weapon, Koto Matsukami, was a technique built entirely on the absolute forced psychological manipulation of a target's mind. Even the most resilient Uchiha could only conceptualize peace through systemic structural control, which leaves us with one final sobering diagnostic conclusion. If the legendary curse of hatred is stripped of its mysticism and exposed for what it truly is, a severe biological processing defect caused by carrying an unerasable camera of horror inside your skull, then the entire moral history of the ninja world must be rewritten. Can we truly blame the Uchiha for breaking down into madness and war? Or is the entire structure of the Shinobi system, a system built on turning children into soldiers and weaponizing grief, guilty of constructing the perfect mechanical engine to destroy them? They built the meat grinder and then blamed the meat for bleeding. The audit is finalized. The files are sealed. If you want to fund the next deep dive lore timeline simulation, make sure to sync with the channel's network matrix, drop a like, subscribe to the database, and share this log to bypass the algorithmic firewalls. Let us know in the comments below which historical hardware profile we should scan next. Transmission ending, terminal closed,